Before I start, I want to thank all of you for coming. I think we have people across at least 5 time zones right now, and requests from at least a couple more time zones to start, like, have a recording of this presentation. So thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to share this work with you for 2 reasons. First, because this PhD journey has been transformational for me, and I want to share that with all of you. But also because I know for a fact that every member of this audience works in some way with local knowledge, with or engineering, with education or research. And we care about these things, even though it may show up differently in our everyday world. And so I want to start with this question. How do we put our values of social justice, learning, and service into action? Because it is a question that concerns all of us, even though these words may mean different things to each of us. And through this work, I found the answers to this question in the context of engineering education, but I hope that it offers you something to take away as well. And with that in mind, I structured the presentation to share what I've learned. And in the end, I invite you to join me for a short activity before we open for questions. When I started in the PhD program, I had the idea that research is like a brick wall, that you mix together some materials, some theory, some data, and then you create something that goes into this wall. And along the way, people might check your work to see if it's worthy of being in this wall. But really, I understood research as a process that is linear and rigid, as a process that inspires a sense of control and structure. And now I've come to realize that this journey is messy and is more like a craft, that you start out with an idea of what you would like to create, and then you collect some tools and materials along the way. And hopefully by the end of it, you've created something that is useful to someone. And as I share my story and my research journey, I hope, like, you might feel lost or uncomfortable at times. And I want to let you know that I felt that way many, many times. But the beauty of the process is that it all comes together in the end. I'll show you some of the important ideas that I picked up along the way. But this work is not just based on the ideas that I collected during this process, but also with the ideas that I brought to this research work. And you can see one of them in this picture. This forest is a devrai, or a sacred grove. It is a patch of land that is offered to the spirits of ancestors or gods. And such devrai are common across India and called, the word devrai is in Marathi, which is my native language. I've been visiting this particular devrai since I was born. And among the many things that I've learned from this devrai, I learned that ancestral knowledge mattered. That over time, I also learned that the knowledge that was passed on through ideas, things, and memories that was shared with people was important. And while I saw that many forms of ancestral knowledge were important, I often saw such knowledge dismissed both within and outside of formal education and professional practice. And through my research, I got the opportunity to take a closer look at knowledge, to ask questions about what is knowledge? How is it created? Why is some knowledge valued more than others? And how can we use this knowledge to create something, to create the kind of world that we want to live and thrive in? And here I'm using this philosophical lens to try and find answers to these questions. So in any process of finding answers to questions in research, it starts with a review of the literature by learning what others have done before us. And in Marathi, one term for book review is parichay, which translates to an introduction. This idea of this Marathi concept of parichay means the idea of familiarity and introduction. And it captures the fact that research is relational, that we can understand parichay, or this form of getting to know, as a series of introductions. It is just like you introduce two people, it is about getting to know and sharing what is known. And you'll see that some of the work or some of the ideas that have influenced my work are included as the scholars at the bottom of this slide, but you'll also of the slides, but you'll also see this approach woven really tightly throughout my research, because relationships have played a big part in my choice of literature, methods, the way I reviewed my findings, so everything in this study. And the best example of how I found of this series of introductions is how I found my theory. So in Reconsidering Reparations, Olufemi Taiwo describes the ancestor perspective. And I read this book when I was visiting my friend Kate in Berlin. And she recommended it to me from her bookshelf. And she told me that her father sent her this book from Dublin. So through this series of introductions, I came to know the work of Olufemi Taiwo. And if we understand theory as a set of ideas and values that influence our decisions in research, then the ancestor perspective was a good fit for my study to hold together all the pieces in my study. Why? Because Taiwo tells us that looking back to the actions and knowledge of our ancestors is looking forward to the tools that we can leave for future generations. And what this means is that we should not only look back to the work of our ancestors, but that we ourselves should think like ancestors, that we have to do the work to put this old knowledge and old traditions in new synthesis to meet our goals for the future. So our relationships determine what pieces of knowledge we get and how we create new knowledge from it. And the approaches of Parichay and ancestor perspective have helped me focus my attention on the questions of how we create knowledge. Knowledge is produced by people using resources and spaces. For example, relationships between students and teachers or research collaborators in formal learning environments influence how knowledge is created, stored, and shared. In the same way, conversations or the stories that are shared around kitchen tables, the sharing of recipes and family histories are also ways in which knowledge is created, stored, or passed on. And of course, people and places interact with and influence each other, and this influences the way that knowledge is produced. But these connections between people and places and the flows between them are not static. These flows are continuous, they are complex, and they are concentrated. But even though it looks complex, this complexity and concentration is not hard to understand. The flow between people and places are shaped by power. Power draws the boundaries that determines what goes in and what goes out, or what stays in and what stays out. And this core concept can be used to understand many forms of injustice, but here I'm using it to understand injustice in the ways that knowledge is created and valued, especially in the context of engineering. Think about how engineering education controls how value is distributed. We talk about valuing hands-on practical skills, but the knowledge of mechanics is not valued the same as the knowledge of mechanical engineers. And there are many examples of, if we start looking at the ways in which like to see whose knowledge and which knowledge is recognized as valuable. And why is this interaction between knowledge and power important for engineering? Because as engineers, we literally build the channels that determines the flow between people. So we enable the connections between people. Think of this connection that we have right now virtually through all of the people who've joined here. Think about the technology that connects us across space and time, about the different modes with which people and resources are moved around the planet. And in building these channels that connect people, we imagine ourselves to be problem solvers. But we often fail to consider whose problems and whose definitions of solutions we are prioritizing in such problem solving. To understand what this means, let's go back to the Devrai example. So the water that you see here is the backwater of a dam, and that caused the part of a Devrai to be submerged and also displaced the local communities. And this is not unique to this location. In any engineering project, we talk about trade-offs. It essentially means that advantages are distributed to some places and people, and disadvantages are distributed to some places and people. So in the context of this dam, we can ask the question of who gets the water and who gets displaced, right? And in engineering, it's important to ask these questions about who is framing the problem, who benefits from the solution, how are burdens and benefits distributed. And these questions often remain unasked. If we claim that engineering is about problem solving, then we cannot afford to dismiss local knowledge that might offer us different answers to these questions. But such local knowledge is routinely dismissed in engineering because of narrow conceptions of what is engineering and who is an engineer. So how can we teach engineering in ways that recognize the value of this local knowledge? That's what I explore in this research through an ancestral perspective, to try and understand how knowledge is created, especially when power and value are distributed asymmetrically. But before that, let's see what is local knowledge. Local knowledge is knowledge connected to a place, obviously, but it's also layered by history and with multiple connections within and across locations. It is a complex landscape that is shaped by the past. And if we want to understand this complex landscape of local knowledge, that requires a serious examination of knowledge of the past in any place. And as I was developing my understanding of local knowledge and knowledge, I was through another series of introductions, I was also coming to know the context and the collaborators for this study. This is Tumaini Innovation Center in Eldoret, Kenya. Tumaini is an accredited technical and vocational training center and supports the education of street youth and marginalized youth in Eldoret. My advisor, Dr. DeBoer, and the leadership of Tumaini have been working together since 2015 to have a localized engineering curriculum. And the goal of the curriculum is to teach foundational engineering skills for community problem solving. Tumaini is a place where there are many power dynamics. They are a technical and vocational training center. They are also a community-based organization. They serve marginalized youth, but also have a lot of international research collaborations and international donors. And so understanding how knowledge is created and valued in this context can offer many insights for how knowledge is created in any location where power asymmetries exist. The teachers at Tumaini who teach this engineering curriculum have formed a community of practice so that they can learn from each other and improve their teaching practice. They're also the bridge between external researchers and the students at Tumaini. And so as a graduate student in DeBoer Lab, I became an insider, outsider within this community of practice. And so the teachers became my collaborators in curriculum design and participants in this research. Now the question was, how do we together create a curriculum that centers local ancestral knowledge? And all of these ideas of knowledge and the connections that led me to Tumaini have influenced the questions that I'm asking and the methods in this work. So these are my research questions, but allow me to share them with you in a different format. This is tedious to read. So the focus of the research questions is how do we co-create learning materials or learning artifacts, as I call them, to remember and recognize local knowledge, but also to use it for the future and to develop a shared understanding of this knowledge. And you can see how the previous pieces have informed the questions that I'm asking here. The ancestor perspective of looking back to look forward, paying attention to how practical value is distributed, and also the idea that local knowledge means different things to each of us in this community of practice. The focus of developing a shared understanding and practical utility also influenced data collection. The data collection happened in two parts. First was discussions around fundamental questions about what is engineering and how do we teach it, which served the purpose of locating ourselves and redrawing some of our mental maps related to this knowledge. But then also practically creating curriculum materials, essentially building new knowledge maps, and hence the term Jenga knowledge maps, because Jenga means to build in Swahili. This work happened over 10 sessions where we worked with specific prompts as well as some snacks and music. And so the data were in the form of the learning artifacts that we made, the things we said, and the things we thought. So I had all this data, and then the next question was, how do I make meaning from all these pieces of data? To understand what the data were telling me, I used an approach of bundling, or gathodi in Marathi. Turning this concept into a method of analysis was refined through many connections in the literature, as well as through conversations with friends, family, and committee members. And gathodi are used to store and share knowledge and memories. And so using gathodi for analysis aligned with my theoretical and methodological approaches for creating, storing, and sharing knowledge. In practice, this meant carefully selecting data segments that felt the most memorable to me, that stuck with me even when I was away from the data. And then I iteratively organized these pieces of data to see what stories each bundle would allow me to tell. I wanted the bundled data segments to tie together multiple meanings, but also to, like, each piece to unlock more knowledge and memories. And in every interaction with all the people and the literature, I was untying and retying these gathodi and refining the stories that I wanted to tell with my data. These methods of data collection and analysis essentially help me answer the question of how we can be in community and co-design an engineering curriculum. And the answer to my question can be summed up as we can be in community and co-design a curriculum when we laugh, when we negotiate, when we collaborate, and when we remember. Now, you might think that is likely to happen when any group of people work together. But these findings gave me new insights into these familiar forms of interaction, especially when we work together to create and curate knowledge. Laughter is a force of generation, mitigation, and disruption of meanings. Negotiation is the practice of agency. Collaboration is creating iteratively, and memory comes before knowledge and provides a new set of connections and recognitions. And I have lots of interesting stories and insights into each of these bundles that are summed up in one sentence for this presentation today. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to talk about the finding of negotiation. In our process of co-creation, we negotiated about our values, our knowledge, and our boundaries. And these negotiations were with ourselves, with each other, and within the power structures that we belonged to. Through our conversations about what is engineering, we identified the many values that are embedded in engineering. One of the first and most frequently revisited examples was of cooking stoves. We talked about Kenyan cooking stoves, such as the Jiko or the Chepkube. The Chepkube has a design of two stoves where residual heat is used to cook ugali, a Kenyan staple. The Jiko is portable, reliable, and affordable. And these designs elements aligned with the teacher's needs and values. In another example, we talked about how roads were constructed, how old ways took nature and the spirituality of sacred places into account, but newer modes of transport cut across even government-protected national parks in Kenya. And through these discussions, we found that the value of efficiency was embedded in engineering design at all scales, from the kitchen to the country. This singular focus on efficiency often meant losing out on other values, such as sustainability or spirituality, which localized designs offered. And all of these conversations together showed me that negotiating the boundaries of what is engineering is important if we want to teach our students to engineer in ways that truly provide values to their community. In our conversations about who is an engineer, we tugged at some boundaries together through expanding the boundaries with consensus or retaining boundaries through disagreements. And I have one comment here that basically sums up all our discussions of who is an engineer. David said that you realize at that time that they were not called engineers, and even now you don't recognize them as engineers, but the work they were doing, that is directly like, oh, this person is an engineer. And at another point in time, he also made the comment that even though they were not recognized, they were there, right? So that's the emphasis from this idea of who is an engineer. One instance of not recognizing engineers was when Kim asked me about my braided hair, that is it true that what they've done to your hair is not engineering? Because he clarified that the students in the hairdressing and beauty class at Tumaini or the catering class often felt like they were not engineers. And so we talked about the skills required to do such kind of work, the spatial visualization, the symmetry, the estimation required, the knowledge of chemistry required. But then Peter pointed out that it's still not considered a technical course according to the Kenyan government. So the hairdressing and beauty or catering classes are not technical according to the accreditation authority in Kenya, which is TVET. So we talked about the power dynamics and how they influence who decides who is considered an engineer. And towards the end, Kim closed the conversation with a comment that I think that I enjoy, so I want to share with you. And then we get into these times when our students are graduating and looking for jobs out there. And surprisingly, those that are local with very local needs, such as hairdressing or catering, they'll get jobs immediately. But the technicians are still waiting for cars from Japan. So some of the common issues in our conversations revolved around what is engineering, who is an engineer, how do we recognize local ancestral knowledge, and how do we bring it into a technical curriculum. And listening closely, I found that all of the answers came back to one question: who decides, right? And in many ways, when we ask the question of who decides, all roads lead to one answer: structures of power. All negotiations happen on this backdrop of structures of power. Sometimes we negotiate to fit in, and sometimes we negotiate to take back or retain things. In our co-design, we kept coming across the point of what should be considered engineering from the point of view of the accreditation authority. Tumaini depends on this accreditation and therefore must stay within the boundaries of expectations laid out by this institution. Power is used to determine what is good enough and what counts, and it is used to organize our worlds, to draw boundaries. But of course, it would be naive to assume, or also chaotic, to assume that we can be completely without boundaries, right? We all want and need boundaries. What is important is how the boundaries are being drawn and by whom. And negotiation can help us examine the knowledge maps and boundaries and see whose interests they serve. Another important way in which my understanding of negotiation changed is that negotiation can be generative. When we try to bring in new and different examples, even if they got, irrespective of whether they got accepted or rejected, we created something new. I learned to see this negotiation less in terms of a power struggle and more as from the perspective of abundance and multiplicity of different knowledges. So negotiation is generative, and we can identify how power influences these negotiations. And considering these two factors together, I realized that negotiation needs to be thoughtful and intentional boundary making. This type of thoughtful and intentional negotiation can help us strengthen practices of agency. We understand agency as a noun, as something that can be given or taken, but this has shown me that agency needs to be a verb, something that we practice. For engineering, we can say, sure, this is engineering, but is this what we want it to be? And if we want it to be something different, how do we change that? How do we teach that? Grappling with these questions is an important part of developing the habits of mind to help us collectively design and organize our cultures in engineering and in education. And such insights from all of the findings helped me generate new questions for the discussion. So today, in the spirit of Parichay, I'm going to extend this discussion as a conversation with all of you. I'm offering you some questions for discussion. For laughter, we can ask, when do we laugh in and at our disciplines? How do we design and redesign our spaces to encourage laughter? For negotiation, we can ask whose maps and boundaries are we using in our work? Do we keep them, expand them, change them? For collaboration, we can ask what is the role of disruptive processes? What is the role of iterative processes? And how do pressures of time and productivity keep us from participating in these disruptive and repetitive processes? For memory, we can ask when we remember or when we try to remember, how does that unlock new knowledge and memories? How can we look back to look forward? Asking and answering all these questions can help us shift our focus from the we in this room to the we that includes our larger communities as well. And this work of building communities includes identifying our own units of actions, but also building coalitions across communities for coordinated action. And when we work with collective agency, we can start paying attention to how value is captured and distributed in ways that are unjust. With these two approaches of collective agency and distributive design, we can develop new structures for our social relations and our material world through engineering education. And the purpose of doing this is not so that local knowledge can get a stamp of approval from what is considered conventional engineering. Rather, the purpose is that we use these new structures to have a more just distribution of resources and power in our processes of creating knowledge. So through this journey, I found some of the answers to the questions that I asked in the beginning. How do we put our values of social justice, learning, and service into action? We do it using an ancestral perspective to remember and radically reimagine our work. We do it in community with co-generation using local ancestral knowledge. And now I have I invite you to join me for the short activity. What are the pieces that you will take away for your bundles? What will you unpack and repack from this? And it can be anything as simple as, I used to think that research was a straight line, and now I know that it can be a winding journey. So maybe we can take a minute or two and then move on to questions. And there's some sheets of paper and pens if you need them. I see people in the chat are already sharing some of their takeaways from this, but yeah, we can move on to questions, but feel free to continue writing and reflecting because that is the point. Any questions on Zoom or in the room?
So you introduced the question, the team, the one you shared with us is, so what is engineering? So through the processes of negotiation, understanding the power dynamic, mapping and all the aspects that you shared, what was I feel like you gave us a key. Right?
This was like, go read my dissertation, please.
So what was like through this process, what did you all come up with the definition?
Right. And I have a word cloud that I could share with you, but basically we came to the understanding that engineering is about solving problems using locally available materials. And then we broke down what we meant by solving problems. We broke down what locally available materials meant. That included local knowledge as histories and geographies and art and all of those things. So really like digging deeper into what is local knowledge. And we did that because there were some instances in which we talked about ancestral knowledge, but the materials required for like creating those artifacts, like whatever they were talking about, were not available locally around Eldoret anymore. And so they're like, okay, yes, we have this knowledge, but we can't show it to our students because we don't know where to get these materials. So then we narrowed it down to like that engineering is problem solving through like using locally available materials.
And as a follow-up to that, how will now that definition be used as they understand that there is a power dynamic and that there's jobs that the students are going to be seeking and different things like that? How is this collective definition going to be incorporated into the curriculums and into the studies, while also understanding that there is a larger power dynamic that may not define engineering in that same way?
So that, I mean, that's a great question. The way they do that is, yeah, essentially teaching students that like, this is engineering, but then this is also engineering. And we have to really start asking questions about what does our community want, and what are the solutions that we can develop that are relevant to our community that meet with their values. So really walking students through this process. And that's what the teachers do in like when they redesign the curriculum. So now so we did this in summer, and they've since then started redesigning the curriculum since September. So the new lessons include all of these examples about the Chapkube and whatever, so that the students get some idea that this is engineering as we understand it today, but our ancestors were also engineers. And so we can use our materials in everyday use to solve our own problems. And I'm trying to look up the. So use. You don't see the word cloud.
We see it on Zoom.
Oh, you see it on Zoom, but not here.
Picture a bunch of words. Yeah, engineering is the big one.
Oh, I guess that's because of the way the device is connected. But yeah, it says what it says problem solving and all of the words in big
Knowledge and technology are some of the bigger ones.
this is what like this was the word cloud of like as we were going through the process, but then this is what we eventually agreed on through multiple sessions. So the word cloud was like in one of the first sessions. And then this was towards the end when we had multiple sessions and discussions debating this. And then also some of the examples, like this happened even after our conversations about who is an engineer, right? And the sessions about who is an engineer were like wild because then they were so like everyone, it was very divergent in a almost chaotic way, because people were sharing examples about like, well, what about these craftsmen, or what about medical practitioners because they also solve problems? What about the shopkeeper because he provides our needs with like what about people's parents? Like people started giving examples of their parents and the kind of like problem solving that they do. And we really used that conversation to like navigate and then synthesize this like, okay, we need some boundaries. We can't include everyone, but the intentional boundary making is what matters. And so this is what we decided is engineering for us.
Like 4 questions online.
Okay, we can go to
Starting from Amir.
yes. And yes,
If you could read them so
Yeah,
that we could
sure.
all hear them, yeah.
So I think the first question for you is, could you share your I used to think about and now I think?
Well, I mean, my whole presentation was that, but like I said, right, like I used to think that research is about is a straight line, is rigid, and that's what it feels like in the beginning. Like that's how you're taught, right? You do the literature review, you gather methods, and then you do data collection and eventually get to the analysis somehow. But for me, it was this really like winding journey. And also there were a lot of times when the right pieces of knowledge like came to me when I needed them. So there was also a lot of these elements which we don't account for in the ways that we teach this. So that was like one of the main ways in which my learning shifted. I used to think about research. For laughter, I will modify the prompt to say, I used to not think about laughter in engineering. And now I think that laughter in engineering is very important, right? It determines how we can be together, and laughter in research too, right? Because laughter in research, like what would your data collection look like if you had more laughter sprinkled in there, right? And if we can't laugh, right, if we are in settings where there is no laughter, then what does that tell us? Not only about the setting, not only about our collaborators, but also about ourselves. So that was also an interesting learning point for me.
Your
We can-
next question
yeah.
from Mohini. So,
Mhm.
yes, how can we negotiate the power dynamics and address the asymmetry to even indigenous knowledge?
Mhm. So, I mean, that's what the point about distributive design was talking about, like really thinking about, like if you're thinking practically in academia, and I know Mohini Maushi works in academia in New Zealand. So, really thinking about how are we writing grants? How are we distributing the resources that we get for creating knowledge to the people who are actually creating knowledge, right? Thinking about how do we bring in that knowledge? And of course, all of this comes with the acknowledgement that there is no way of working with knowledge, or like there's no epistemic orientation that can undo the current power structures as they exist. So of course, it comes with that acknowledgement that we can't merely focusing on epistemic justice cannot change power asymmetries everywhere. But yeah, some of the ways in which we can do that is to really consider how value is being distributed. For example, in this dissertation research, I have captured the lion's share of the value, even though this is something that the teachers and I co-created, right? I get a doctoral degree out of it. And the teachers get like practical curriculum materials. And to me, that is not, and also to the teachers, I imagine, that is not a fair distribution. So how do we change institutions? How do we change our processes so that we can try and balance out some of these things? And also because value means different things to different people, right? Like in some sense, for the teachers, getting maybe some journal publications out of this is valuable. So how do we do that? How do we recognize what is valuable? And that requires us to be in community, to be in these relationships and learn from each other what we value, and then work towards creating these things together.
So especially when you put up the picture with the thatch roof huts and and talked about road design,
Right.
I was reminded of one of the best examples of community inspired design was my alma mater. They put up a new building and they didn't pave any path to it. They let the community decide. And it was fantastic because eventually paths got worn in the grass and then they paved those, right?
Right.
But it struck me, again, based on your work, like there are still people who didn't get a voice there, right?
Mhm.
Because maybe, because it's based on the consensus of the average person
Yes.
and the path they take,
Yes.
right? Those are the paths that will get most worn and then they get paved.
Yeah.
How do you find all the voices of the people who need to have a say in, like, so maybe those paths are too steep for someone who is in a wheelchair
Mhm.
or has other mobility disabilities?
Yeah.
How do you find all the voices?
I guess by asking questions, because I mean, that's where it starts, right? And that's the point about the local knowledge being like, even if something is local, there are dominant voices within what we are considering the radius of local, and those dominant voices will then determine. So recognizing that even there a power structure exists. First, recognizing that is an important point. Once we recognize it, we can ask questions about, okay, so how is this power structured, right? Learning more about that through your relationships with people. Then asking questions about, okay, if these people if this is the way in which the power is unbalanced, how can we try to balance some of it? So asking questions in different ways and to different people to try and recognize what existing power structures are in any location. And also, yeah, thank you for bringing this up, because so they drew this picture to give the example of the huts. So the huts were the example of the engineering design here. that their ancestors were engineers and all of the materials. And that's what the discussion around this is. But then as we were talking, Kim suddenly looked at this path and he's like, I have a question, like, why is this path curved? And, we used to have these, we used to have paths like this, which were more natural, which took into account the landscape. And he gave the example that sometimes the path will go around this fig tree, which is sacred, and you don't want to cut it down. But now, and that's when they said that that Nairobi National, there's a train track that cuts right across Nairobi National Park. And I was like, but it's a government protected park. And they said, yes, but the train is also built by the government. So.
And then I think there were
10 more
two
questions.
more,
I think 3 more.
3 more. Okay, Shania.
I have 2 questions. One is easy. So the language also carries some meaning.
Mhm.
For example, in Turkish, the term mühendis, which means engineer,
Mhm.
comes from the Arabic word means geometry.
Okay,
Geometry, math.
Right, okay.
I'm curious in the languages,
Mhm.
if there was a meaning, underlying meaning under the term.
Definitely. And that happened in like the who is an engineer conversation, because in Swahili, there are 2 terms, like one is manda.
It's the more.
Mafundi is like often associated with craftsmen and laborers, whereas like mandasi is Mandisi is associated. I always make this mistake.
Yeah.
I was introducing myself once, and instead of saying that I'm an engineer, I said I'm a Kenyan donut because I said Italian. But it's fine. So they are considered engineers, and that distinction is, I mean, it used to exist before, but I think now is mostly along the lines of class. And also in Marathi, we have the same terminology. Like we'll have Gavandi or Pigari who do the actual labor or like the masonry work or whatever. And obviously they are considered as different from the engineers, even though the types of knowledge needed are different, but I don't think that justifies how they're valued differently.
You can say the other question for donuts.
I can't.
Now I want to hear it.
You insist. So you are expanding the definition of engineering,
Mhm.
the boundaries. I wonder if you are running into the boundaries of a different discipline that, I don't know whether it is arts, whether it is entrepreneurship, like in this definition, in some way I'm asking what is not engineering
Mhm.
within the definition.
Yeah, and we did run into that like a couple of times with like not specifically with other disciplines, because also, I mean, engineering, we say engineering is multidisciplinary, right? Like we demand that disciplines work together to solve problems. So we didn't run into it in that sense, but we did run into what is not engineering in the sense of examples about like problem solving. There were a lot, because the students at Tumaini experience a lot of personal trauma, and the teachers were talking about we want the students to use these problem solving skills to also solve problems in their personal lives. But then we made the distinction that problem solving is not engineering, right? Even though, I mean, maybe some arguments can be made, but that's the decision we made. We didn't want to conflate the 2. Or there was another instance of cultural examples that were being shared, like specific ceremonial songs that were sung for specific ceremonies, and even though the teachers agreed that yes, this is cultural, but this is not engineering, and we don't want it in the curriculum. So then making the distinction between all culture is not engineering, all problem solving is not engineering. So those were some of the things that we negotiated around.
I think that'll be some more donut conversation. Briefly, the 3 questions.
Yes. So Nat has a couple of questions. Can you talk about how your identity played a role in how you worked with your teachers?
Mhm.
And the follow-up to that is what lessons did you learn about positionality in this context?
So, I mean, as you can see throughout this thing, my identity has played a big part, not just like my identity, but all of me has played a big part in shaping this dissertation in everything from how I was engaging with the literature, how I was trying to bring in Marathi words, and not to try and do something different, but because it resonated with me. I made sense of these ways of doing research in a way that resonated better with me, and that's how my identity like shaped the work. And in the context of the relationship with the teachers, we did some pilot sessions for co-design in 2022, and that's when like my identity like really came into play, because I would share examples with them that were in Marathi. So I would say, do you have any proverbs that we can use for engineering problem solving? And this is a Marathi proverb, and this is what it means. This is what we can use the Marathi proverb. So we have a Marathi proverb that basically means that just because the sugar cane is sweet, like don't eat it from the root. And it applies to engineering as like not overusing any one solution. And I explained that to them, and that was able to like do that work of like sparking new knowledge and memories for the teachers, things that they already knew, but that they could bring into this space. So I think in some ways I tried to use my positionality to open the gateways for the teachers to feel free to bring themselves into the curriculum, just like I was bringing myself into the research and into the curriculum.
So I think the next question is from Moses. So yes, can you please go back to the laugh, negotiate, remember image?
Yes. This one?
Yeah, I think then the question is, the idea of laughter in engineering is mind-boggling to me. How do we better incorporate laughter in engineering discourse?
I mean, that is a great question. And I think that ties very well to Nat's question, because to encourage laughter, and laughter in the sense that is more generative, we need to create space to be ourselves in any space, and that's what can lead to laughter, right? When I designed the co-design sessions, I had like snacks and music. The music was like a curated COP playlist, which had some of my favorite songs, including songs in like Marathi and Hindi, and some of the teachers' favorite songs in Swahili and English. And so really like setting up this environment for us to have fun, but also I was still not expecting laughter. So you're right, because that's not the first thing that comes to mind. And I set up this environment for us to have fun, but I was still not expecting laughter. But yeah, if we are more intentional about it, maybe the first step to do that is to set up this environment where people can be themselves. They are encouraged to be creative, to feel free in breaking boundaries in this way, not only in epistemological ways, but ontological ways, like to create space for that informal learning. So that is like one part of the question. And then what was the second part? How do we
better incorporate laughter in engineering discourse? I think that
was the question. Okay, so
Let's go to the last one, and then I think we have to, yeah.
I think we're done. Those are what the
Okay.
questions that we have.
Last comment.
So I'm not sure if I'm one of the few non-engineers in the room. So I'm gonna make a comment that I'm gonna ask you to answer privately, but maybe everyone else needs to think about it. Is it, as I'm listening to everyone kind of talk about these in the questions, is it that the boundaries of engineering need to be expanded, or is it that engineers need to learn to stay in their lanes a little bit more? You're gonna answer that later, but.
Food for thought.
Or donuts if you have, yeah.
So with that, let's all think about our lanes, but let's also give Nrupaja a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you all for being part of this and generating some new important thoughts.
Yeah.
Leave the leave the cards here.
Yes, I would love to.
You want to sign
Thank you. And thank you folks online. I'm really sorry that I had to mute people, but because we were expecting so many people and some were joining from their phones, I wanted to make sure there was no disruption. But thank you all for joining. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me.
So folks could kindly exit. We have more questions.